Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of the Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and we really appreciate you joining us for this special episode. Today, we get to solve one of the world's great unsolved mysteries. For 70 years, the identity of the man whose body was found on a beach outside of Adelaide, Australia, on December 1st, 1948, has been frustratingly elusive. With no identification found on him, and many strange elements involved with the body and his personal effects, speculation has run rampant. Some believed he was a Russian spy, a jilted lover poisoned by his partner, a smuggler, a former ballet dancer, or even a time traveler. We now know, with a high degree of certainty, exactly who he was and what he was doing on that beach. If you are not familiar with the case, or would like a refresher, I would highly suggest you start with part 1, as there are a lot of intriguing elements to be considered, and it is fun to see how some theories were so wrong, and others very close to what we are about to reveal. But before we get to that, 'tis the season for scary stories. We hope you can join us this Saturday night at the Fox Theatre in Toronto, the Bytown Cinema in Ottawa, or the Screening Room in Kingston, Ontario, as we revive the Victorian tradition of sharing ghost stories to celebrate the holidays. Storytellers from the Haunted Walk will spread spooky cheer with spellbinding tales of the otherworldly and supernatural with a holiday spin. We will also screen thematic short films throughout the evening to add to your eerie experience. For a select few, you can even join us on a paranormal investigation of the theater afterwards. For information on our evening of haunted holiday stories in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, please visit our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. It is also our final call for our haunted holiday cards. Only a few remain, and they are now going for 75% off. And you can find those by accessing our online gift shop through our website. Please be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk, to get the latest updates and news from us. And as it is the holiday season and a time of giving, if you are enjoying our episodes, it would mean a great deal to us if you could leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen. And while you're gathering with friends and families over the holidays, if you know someone enjoys a great ghost story, we hope you will recommend Haunted Talks to them. Derek Abbott, a professor from the University of Adelaide, who has dedicated years of his life to discovering the identity of the Somerton Man, says the body of a man found on one of the city's beaches in 1948 belonged to Carl Webb, who often went by Charles, an electrical engineer and instrument maker born in Melbourne in 1905. Using DNA sequencing, Abbott says he and genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick were able to locate the final piece of the puzzle that has captivated historians, amateur sleuths, and conspiracy theorists for more than 70 years. Using strands of the man's hair trapped in a plastered death mask made by police in the late 1940s provided him with what he says is proof of the man's identity. The hair was examined for years by a team of DNA experts at the University of Adelaide, who provided the DNA information that allowed Abbott and Fitzpatrick to further narrow the field. By this past March, Abbott said he had already established Webb's name through years of painstaking work with Fitzpatrick to build a complex family tree of around 4,000 names that led to Webb, whose date of death had not been recorded. By filling out this tree, we managed to find a first cousin, 3 times removed on his mother's side, Abbott told CNN, and on July 23rd, they matched DNA obtained from the hair to DNA tests taken from Webb's distant relatives. It just felt like I climbed and I was at the top of Mount Everest, said Abbott, of the moment they made the apparent DNA match. It should be noted, though, the authorities have not finished their own forensic analysis yet from the DNA taken from the body itself, which was exhumed last May. But those results are expected very soon. Joining us to discuss the science involved in solving this mystery and other cold cases is Dr. Lars Petersen, an instructor from the University of Calgary. Dr. Petersen, welcome back to Haunted Talks. When you appeared in our first episode about this mystery, you promised to join us again if news broke. And we appreciate you keeping your promise and walking us through some of the science today. I must say, though, recently re-listening to our interview, many of the comments you made were very prescient in how this case could be solved. In our discussion, we were primarily focused on the events of May 2021, when the body of the Somerton man was exhumed so that DNA could be gathered and tested by authorities. However, the DNA that they used was not the DNA that led to the revelation of the Somerton man's identity. Rather, it was hair follicles trapped in a plaster cast that was made of the man's face by the police in 1948. In 2011, some of the hair samples were turned over to researcher Derek Abbott and his team of scientists at the University of Adelaide for analysis. It took almost a decade to get from those hair samples to solving the mystery. Dr. Petersen, could you explain to us what is happening behind the scenes as the scientists were working with these samples, and what kind of breakthrough was necessary to narrow down the potential pool of people or suspects to a manageable number?
I think one of the important things to recognize is that the researcher, Dr. Abbott, was working on some hair samples that were provided to him so he could do his own analysis to look at the gene sequences. The forensic samples that were collected following the recovery of the body, as far as I know, are still ongoing or haven't been released yet. And those are going to be made using samples collected from bone marrow and teeth, because there are probably still some reliable DNA samples to be collected there. So the identification of the Somerton man has been made with pretty good certainty, and certainly Dr. Abbott is very certain about his results. But I think what is really interesting about the work that Dr. Abbott did was starting about 10 years ago, doing some of the gene sequencing and doing some of the DNA analysis then, used a lot of the databases that were available at the time, which were primarily based off of a lot of things like the genetic markers that we find on Y chromosomes, which are present in a lot of forensic databases. Also using things like mitochondrial DNA as the primary source material for some of these databases, because it's much smaller, easier to sequence, and easier to collect large samples of. In 2012 is when we started to see the increase in use of these genealogy services, things like Ancestry.com and 23andMe, which are sequencing and collecting and profiling people based on autosomal chromosomes. And so I can talk really briefly about the difference between those two. Autosomal chromosomes are all the chromosomes that we inherit from both our parents, and we have 2 copies of each. The testing is much more comprehensive on these because there are literally hundreds of thousands of markers that can be tested and used to compare. But the limitation with autosomal testing is that you sort of get a dilution of the similarities between different people as sort of with each generation. So each generation you kind of dilute by about 50%. And so making really strong connections to family trees, you can only really go back about 5 to 6 generations and really only find similarity between up to about second or third cousins. Mitochondrial DNA, on the other hand, is DNA that is localized in the mitochondria of all of our cells. And it is something that is passed down from mother to child and creates what is called a matrilineage, which is basically the line of mothers that have continuously passed down mitochondrial DNA to their offspring. What's interesting about that is that mitochondrial DNA doesn't change nearly as quickly as autosomal DNA. And because you have this direct passage of mitochondria from mother to offspring, comparing siblings, for example, with autosomes, you'd have 50% similarity roughly, and likewise 50% similarity to each of your parents. With mitochondrial DNA, you would have presumably 100% similarity between you and your sibling, and both of you would be 100% similar to your mother. And this allows researchers to trace back mitochondrial DNA potentially thousands of years with very minimal changes. So the breakthrough is likely resulting from just the massive increase in available data in a lot of these databases. So when we look at things like Ancestry or 23andMe, we're talking, annual user increases of in the tens of millions. Basically, we've seen sort of a doubling of the number of people submitting samples to these services every year since about 2012. So there's just a huge number of these things available. And when you combine some of these autosomal DNA resources with some of the mitochondrial resources, you can trace back these mitochondrial DNA sources to particular haplogroups. So you can trace the maternal lineage very precisely back to different regions of the world. And you can also see that if you have 2 individuals that you suspect are related through their maternal lineage, then you can tell very easily whether or not they are or not by looking at these haplogroups. And then you can compare the additional autosomal markers to sort of confirm that. So combining these 2 approaches, along with the massive amount of data that is sort of growing in these databases every year, allows you to make some pretty precise comparisons and kind of zero in on particular family trees. It's almost a waiting game, hoping that somebody sharing some ancestral lineage with the Somerton Man, in this case, just sort of submits their sample for their own genealogical testing. After increasing the amount of data that was available, there was a hit that came up that matched a little bit more closely and allowed them to narrow down the particular region and perhaps even the particular ancestor, which they could then sort of follow through the available family tree to get to where they were.
After finding a positive match with members of the Webb family who put their family tree on a genealogical website, Professor Abbott contacted Stuart Webb, believed to be the great-grandson of the Somerton man's brother. And to me, this felt like a moment almost out of like an Indiana Jones movie as the Webb family start going through their dusty photographic archives to see if they can find a visual trace of this person. And at first they think they spot him in this family group shot. There's about 20 people in it, but it's unlabeled and, they're not quite certain. And then a week later, they find, I think in the same album, that 2 of the pages have been stuck together. And when they pry them apart, there's a much closer photo, which is labeled Grandpa, Grandma, Roy, and Charlie, which leads to the name Charles Webb. Colleen Fitzpatrick, who did the genealogical work in the case, says she is 100% certain that they have the right guy, that Charles Webb is the Somerton Man. But forensic scientist and criminologist Yanthi Mollett is cautious about accepting the results, saying, "I'm not sure we'll ever be absolutely certain. What we would do in a forensic contest normally is to take deceased DNA and compare that with something we knew belonged to them, like a toothbrush or a hairbrush. We haven't got that here. So my concern is that we may never be able to categorically say that we know this person's identity. Given what you know about the case from a scientific point of view, how likely do you think it is that Charles Webb is the Somerton Man?"
The Somerton Man is dead, and we can't find additional DNA to make that 100% comparison. And so, in the absence of that evidence, in the absence of the direct comparison with existing DNA samples and the samples that have been collected by the forensic geneticists, we wouldn't be able to make 100% certainty. But I think we can get really close to that based on the fact that, as we mentioned, we have the haplogroup, which shows the maternal lineage for the Webb family, and that appears to match with Stuart Webb. And we also have the autosomal markers, which again are going to suffer from that dilution effect, but the combination of the two can make us pretty confident that this is a match. Again, the forensic scientists are going to be hesitant to say with 100% certainty that we have a match because we don't have any existing DNA samples for Charles Webb to compare with the Somerton Man. But I think the process that was followed by Dr. Abbott was probably the best approach that we're going to get. And I think we probably have found who the Somerton Man is.
Now that we know the identity of the Somerton Man, a lot of other information about his life has come to light. Webb was born on November 16, 1905, in a suburb of Melbourne. He was the youngest of 6 siblings, and as a young man worked in the family bakery business. Little is known about his early life, but he later married Dorothy Robertson, known as Doff Webb. The last record we have of him is in April 1947, when he left Dorothy. Colleen Fitzpatrick, founder of Identifiers International, a genealogical research agency involved in some of America's most high-profile cold cases, she told CNN that he disappeared, and she appeared in court saying he had disappeared and she wanted a divorce. They had no known children. Fitzpatrick and Abbott say Robertson filed for divorce in Melbourne, but 1951 documents reveal she had moved to Butte, South Australia, 144 kilometers northeast of Adelaide, potentially establishing a link to the neighboring state where the body was found. In the divorce papers, she described Charles as violent, threatening, and moody, a man with no particular friends of his own, who was often in bed by 7 p.m. He has written many poems, most of them on the subject of death, which he claims to be his greatest desire, Dorothy wrote in court documents. This seemingly connects the mysterious scrap of paper found in the Somerton Man's pocket, which turned out to be an excerpt from the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, described as poetry about death. One day in 1946, Dorothy came home to their flat to find Charles in a terrible state. "I found him lying in a wet bed, gazing into space," she said in the divorce papers. "He could hardly speak and was rambling. The flat reeked of ether and anesthetic, so strong that other tenants had complained." In the days after Charles's overdose, Dorothy helped nurse him back to health. She said even hand-feeding him. But as soon as he was able to regain his strength, he told Dorothy that she was a fool to help him get better, and from then on, he became more violent. interventions by the police and Dorothy's parents were not enough to protect her. In September 1946, after years of physical and verbal abuse and threats against her life, Dorothy fled the flat and the marriage with only the money in her pocket. Charles moved out in 1947, and no one knows for sure what drew him to Adelaide the following year. Do you remember how the clothes linked to the Somerton Man, found in a train station, had labels with the name T. Keane on them? Webb, as it turns out, had a sister who lived in Melbourne and was married to a man named Thomas Keane. Likely the T. Keane, whose name appears on the clothing in the Somerton Man suitcase, were likely items he had gotten from his brother-in-law. Webb was an avid gambler and loved betting on horse races. This may explain the code found in the Rubaiyat, which had long been speculated by some that the letters corresponded to horses' names. Carolyn Willsborough, a University of South Australia lecturer who made a documentary about the Somerton Man case, told the Australian Broadcasting Corporation that this very much sounds like Charles was attempting suicide. This story turns out that it is not some wild spy drama. It really is a sad, tragic, domestic situation. The doctor who carried out the post-mortem examination in 1949 found the stomach was deeply congested with blood, and that death had been caused by heart failure due to poisoning, which at this point we must conclude was self-administered. The suspicion by the police at the time that the small section of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam found in Webb's pocket, which reads Taman should, and roughly translates to "it is finished," was indeed a poetic suicide note. It may be disappointing to some who have followed this case to learn that Somerton Man was not a spy, a time traveler, an alien, or something else as equally dramatic. However, there is something to be said for giving this man his name back, which was denied for so long, and for a family that, while they never met him, still consider him as one of their own, warts and all, and hope that he is finally at peace. There are countless more mysteries for us still to explore and solve, but for this one, the case seems closed. A big thank you to Dr. Lars Petersen for joining us and sharing his scientific insights on the case. For information about our evening of haunted holiday stories taking place in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto on Saturday, December 17th, please visit our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk. And if you are feeling the Christmas spirit, we would certainly appreciate a 5-star review wherever you listen to us. As always, season's greetings to our talented Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor. Until we meet again, seasoned screamings and sweet dreams.